I stepped onto the deck with a thrill I hadn't felt in years, my suitcase rolling smoothly behind me as the smell of salt and sea breeze tangled with the faint scent of varnished wood. The cruise promised a week of escape, routine excursions, and endless blue horizons, but the moment I crossed the gangway, something felt off. The crew smiled, practiced and polished, yet their eyes flickered too quickly, like they were hiding something. At first I shrugged it off, attributing the chill crawling up my spine to excitement. By the time I reached my cabin, the ship hummed around me in an oddly mechanical rhythm. Midnight was creeping closer when I noticed it. The hallways were subtly longer than they had been just an hour ago. Doors didn't quite line up. The floor seemed to tilt ever so slightly underfoot. A faint whisper brushed my ear, so soft I thought it might have been the wind. Then I saw it. My itinerary had changed. Excursions vanished or appeared with times I never booked. Panic didn't hit all at once. It slithered, slow and cold, through my veins. The ship felt alive, almost watchful. I realized that no one had warned me, and suddenly this routine vacation didn't feel routine at all. Isolation settled in, a claustrophobic weight pressing from every polished corridor, every shadowed corner. I rushed to the information desk, heart hammering, itinerary clutched tightly in my hand. The woman behind the counter gave me a practiced smile, but when I asked about the changes, her gaze flicked over me like she didn't quite see me. "Everything should be fine," she said, voice airy, almost rehearsed. I pointed to my cabin number, the excursions I'd booked, the meals scheduled at odd hours. She shrugged, a subtle deflection, and turned back to her computer, leaving me with a creeping sense of dismissal that made my stomach knot. I wandered the halls, checking the bulletin boards. The excursions were there on paper, yes, but the times didn't match. Some activities didn't even exist on the ship map I'd been given. I passed passengers in the corridors. Most glanced at me with polite smiles, but a few stared too long, their faces blank, their movements slightly too synchronized. One man tilted his head unnaturally as I walked past, as if observing me for patterns I couldn't understand. By then, shadows began playing tricks on my eyes. A hallway light flickered, and for a split second, a figure stretched impossibly long, across the wall, bending in ways a human body never could. I spun toward the mirrors lining the corridor. My reflection stared back, but something lingered just behind me, something that vanished the moment I blinked. Each small anomaly gnawed at my mind, each silence between creaks and distant laughter amplifying the tension. I felt the ship respond to me, like it breathed around me, shifting subtly in rhythm with my own pulse. I tried to find a crew member, again someone who might explain, but every answer was vague, a shrug or a hurried apology. Panic hovered at the edges of reason. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, distant yet immediate, as if the corridors themselves were extending, reshaping, keeping me from reaching the places I needed. I leaned against a wall, trembling, trying to steady my breath, and the whisper returned. Soft, intimate, and impossibly close, saying nothing I could understand. I realized then that the ship wasn't just a setting. It was active, watching, testing me. And with every passing second, the boundaries between reality and something far darker blurred, leaving me stranded in the unfamiliar, hostile corridors of what was supposed to be my escape. Night had settled over the ship like a living shroud, and I found myself drawn to corridors I hadn't noticed before, doors tucked into shadows as if they had only appeared for me. My cabin map was useless, now. Stairwells twisted in impossible angles, hallways stretched further than reason allowed, and every corner I turned seemed to fold back on itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was alive, rearranging itself while I moved, a maze that was both familiar and alien. As I navigated this shifting labyrinth, I began seeing other passengers, figures huddled in alcoves or pacing aimlessly, eyes glazed and distant. One whispered to another, barely audible, "It's the shift. The ship is changing." Their voices were hollow, carried an edge of fear that mirrored my own. I tried to speak to them, but they recoiled as if I were invisible, their attention swallowed by some unseen force. My pulse quickened, each step echoing unnaturally, bouncing off walls that seemed to elongate with every footfall dot. At one point, I felt a sudden vertigo, the floor tilting beneath me as if I had stepped onto a moving deck. I grabbed the railing of a stairwell, my hands slick with sweat, questioning whether my senses were betraying me. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting sharp, fragmented shadows that danced in impossible directions. A door creaked somewhere behind me, then slammed without warning, the sound reverberating through the narrow hall dot. And then I saw it. A figure perched at the far end of the corridor, barely visible, yet unmistakably watching me. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention, a pressure that settled into my chest. I squinted and it vanished, leaving only the distorted shadows of the hallway in its place. My breathing caught. Cold sweat running down my spine. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but the layout no longer offered familiar exits. The ship itself seemed to close in, corridors stretching endlessly, staircases looping impossibly, doors appearing and disappearing at will. I realized that I was no longer simply exploring a ship. I was navigating a living entity, aware of me, testing me, and perhaps punishing me. Reality felt fluid, and I couldn't trust my eyes or my mind. Something was in the darkness, watching, patient and waiting for me to make a mistake. I stumbled upon a door tucked behind a narrow stairwell I had never noticed, its frame almost hidden in shadow. Pushing it open revealed a lounge frozen in time. Chairs were toppled, drinks half spilled, and personal items left mid-use. Books open on pages no one would ever return to, phones lying face down as if their owners had simply vanished. My stomach churned as I moved among the remnants, the silence pressing in, punctuated only by the soft groan of the ship settling against the waves. It felt wrong, as though I had uncovered a secret the crew wanted buried, a trace of those who had crossed paths with this place and never returned. As I examined the scattered belongings, patterns emerged. Excursions and meal schedules, cabin numbers, and times were eerily repeated, forming sequences that hinted at something deliberate. The ship wasn't randomly shifting. It was orchestrated, its strange itinerary changes part of a dark design I could barely comprehend. My hands trembled as I returned to my cabin, hoping for a glimpse of normalcy, only to find the condensation on my mirror forming words I couldn't ignore. "You shouldn't be here." My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale, but the voice of the message seemed to seep into my mind, a warning carved from the cold fog of the room. Panic set in, thick and heavy, and I grabbed my bag, rushing for the deck, certain that escape was near. But as I stepped out, the familiar horizon had vanished. The ship's course had shifted, cutting me off from any recognizable route, the ocean stretching endlessly with no landmarks, no port in sight. Waves crashed against the steel hull with a metallic clang that made the air taste of iron, while lights flickered above, throwing long, jagged shadows across the corridors and decks. Every step I took felt mirrored, distorted, as though the ship itself anticipated my movements, guiding me toward its unseen will. I pressed my palms to the railing, the salty spray mingling with a chemical tang I couldn't place. My mind spun with questions, the logic I clung to slipping like water through my fingers. The vessel's groans and creaks were not just sounds, they were messages, threats, affirmations of control. The claustrophobia wrapped tighter, the night thicker, and I understood that I was not merely lost. I was trapped in a living entity, suspended in time and space, with every sense screaming that this voyage would end differently than any vacation I had ever imagined. I darted down a corridor that seemed to stretch farther than physics allowed, my heart hammering as the metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. Around me, shadows shifted unnaturally, elongating and recoiling as though the walls themselves were alive. Then I saw them, crew members standing silently at intervals, faces, serene yet unnervingly empty. Their eyes followed me with a precision that felt deliberate, too knowing to be innocent. One stepped forward, voice low and rehearsed. "It's best you stay where you belong." Panic surged. I turned on my heel, sprinting deeper into the ship's maze, every hallway morphing before my eyes. Doors appeared and disappeared, stairwells, twisted into loops, and even familiar signage became meaningless symbols of a language I couldn't decipher. I pressed my back against a wall, listening, straining to understand the rhythm of this living vessel. The groans of metal, the distant echo of waves against steel, and the faint, almost imperceptible whispers intertwined in a sinister harmony. I couldn't tell if the ship was haunted, cursed, or a figment of my fraying mind. Each corner I rounded brought fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows that darted just beyond my vision, hints of figures watching, guiding, or perhaps hunting. My breath came in short gasps as I calculated each step, each turn, trying to find a lifeboat, a hatch, any exit that promised salvation. I paused in a dimly lit lounge, heart pounding, and realized the crew wasn't trying to harm me directly. They were agents of the ship itself, complicit in its labyrinthine control. The reality of the vessel as an entity sank into me like ice in my veins. I moved again, every motion deliberate yet frantic, alternating between quiet observation and desperate bursts of speed, chasing safety that seemed to dissolve before my eyes. Finally, I glimpsed what could be a lifeboat hatch, illuminated by a faint green glow. I ran toward it, limbs trembling, senses screaming in unison, only to find the corridor behind me had shifted. I was back where I had started, the ship's layout mocking my effort. Every instinct screamed that escape was possible, yet impossible, a paradox wrapped in steel and darkness. My mind raced, trying to reconcile logic with the creeping terror that the vessel itself was alive, aware and perhaps indifferent to my survival. In that moment, I understood the cruel reality. I wasn't just a passenger. I was a part of the ship's design, trapped in its shifting corridors with no certainty of freedom. I burst onto what I thought was an open deck, the night air whipping. Against my face, the sound of waves crashing against the hull ringing like a promise of freedom. My chest heaved, lungs burning, and for a heartbeat I allowed myself to believe I had finally escaped the ship's suffocating grip. The horizon seemed endless, yet familiar. Relief surged, fleeting and fragile. But as I stepped forward, the deck shifted beneath me, the railing bending oddly, the lights flickering with a rhythm I had come to recognize. The exit led me back to the same corridor where my journey had begun, the same eerie silence greeting me. Panic clawed at me, raw and unrelenting. The ship was not a vessel. It was a predator, sentient and patient, looping its victims through endless corridors and stairwells. Behind me, I thought I saw movement, shadows gathering, shapes that hinted at the crew, or something far older, far darker, watching, waiting for the next misstep. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, the salty metallic tang of fear thick in the air. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't over. And then, just as suddenly as the illusion of safety appeared, I was swallowed again into the maze, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving. Somewhere, another passenger would soon hear the whispers, see the shadows, and step aboard. The cruise would claim them as it had me, leaving only questions and the cold, unending hum of the sea. The moment I stepped onto the cruise ship, excitement coursed through me, a warm rush that promised escape from the monotony of everyday life. But almost immediately, a flicker of unease prickled at the edges of my consciousness. The corridors, stretched in ways that felt just slightly off, angles misaligned and walls too polished, reflecting light that didn't belong. Passengers passed me with vacant expressions, smiles that didn't reach their eyes that seemed to follow me, even when I wasn't looking. Crew members offered directions and reassurances, but their words were clipped, distant, as if rehearsed. By the time I reached my cabin, a hush had settled over the ship, and the hum of engines felt louder than it should, almost alive. As night fell, the horizon beyond the deck showed nothing. No twinkling lights of approaching ports, no familiar landmarks, just an endless dark expanse. Footsteps echoed where no one walked, and a faint whisper seemed to curl around the edges of my hearing, teasing and elusive. I checked the itinerary and froze. Nothing matched what I had been promised. Times shifted, and excursions had vanished. A creeping realization settled over me. This ship was not what I thought it was. It was alive, aware, and I was utterly alone. Isolation wrapped around me like a thick, wet blanket, and I understood that my vacation had become something far darker, something I could not yet comprehend. I rushed to the information desk, clutching the itinerary like a lifeline. The woman behind the counter offered a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Everything should be fine," she said, her tone light, rehearsed, like a line she had repeated 1,000 times. I pointed out the discrepancies, the excursions I had booked, the meal times that didn't make sense, but she only nodded and waved me off, returning to her screen. My heart sank as I realized no one seemed concerned about my confusion, as if the ship itself had swallowed my presence and spat out indifference. I wandered the halls, scanning bulletin boards and digital displays. Some activities had vanished entirely. Others were scheduled at hours that defied reason. Passengers moved past me in eerie patterns, faces blank, eyes distant, as if following a rhythm I couldn't hear. One man tilted his head unnaturally, holding my gaze a moment too long before turning away with mechanical precision. Shadows began to behave strangely. A corridor light flickered, and for a heartbeat, a figure stretched across the wall, bending in ways no human could. I spun toward the mirrors lining the halls. My reflection stared back, but there was something else behind me. A fleeting silhouette, gone the instant I blinked. The air seemed heavier, oppressive, and I realized the ship itself was watching, its corridors subtly shifting with each step I took. I sought another crew member, desperate for explanation, but each interaction was the same, vague, evasive, hurried. My pulse raced, my breathing shallow. Footsteps echoed, distant yet immediate, as if following my every move. The whisper returned, faint but intimate, curling around my ear with words I couldn't comprehend. I leaned against a wall, hands trembling, trying to anchor myself to some shred of reality. The boundaries between what was real and what the ship conjured blurred with every turn, every reflection, every shadow. By the time I finally reached my cabin, anxiety had transformed into a gnawing fear. I was no longer a guest on a ship. I was a participant in something alive, something hostile, and there was no clear way to understand or escape it. Night had draped the ship in a heavy, suffocating darkness, and I found myself drawn to corridors I hadn't noticed before. Tucked, away behind corners that didn't appear on my map. The air smelled faintly of salt and something metallic like blood or rust, and every step I took seemed to echo farther than it should. Hallways stretched unnaturally, folding in on themselves as if the ship were breathing, reshaping the layout, with each passing moment. Stairwells twisted impossibly, looping back in ways that defied logic, and the longer I walked, the more disoriented I became. In the dim light, I spotted other passengers, figures huddled against walls, pacing endlessly, murmuring words I couldn't fully hear. "The endless seat, the shift," one whispered to another, voice hollow, distant, as though carried on a current I couldn't feel. Their eyes were glazed, vacant, yet every so often they flicked toward me, as if aware I didn't belong. I tried to speak, but my voice sounded tinny, swallowed by the walls, and they recoiled as if I were invisible. My stomach knotted, and I realized I wasn't just lost. I was intruding on some pattern, some rhythm of the ship I couldn't comprehend. Vertigo hit me suddenly, a wave of nausea that made the floor feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. I gripped the railing of a stairwell, trying to anchor myself, but the lights overhead flickered in jagged bursts, casting shadows that moved independently of any source. At the far end of a hallway, I glimpsed something or someone watching. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but I felt its attention, heavy and deliberate, pressing against the back of my mind. The figure vanished the instant I blinked, leaving only distorted shadows in its place. Reality fractured. The ship's corridors twisted, the familiar warped into the unfamiliar, and I realized I was trapped inside a living maze, one that bent perception and toyed with fear. Every turn, every glance, every whispered echo reminded me that this voyage was no longer about leisure or escape. It was about survival. I had stepped into a nightmare that shifted with every heartbeat, and there was no way out I could see. Stumbled upon a door I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a narrow stairwell almost swallowed by shadows. Hesitating only a moment, I pushed it open and stepped into a lounge frozen in time. Chairs were toppled, drinks left half-finished on tables, books open to pages that would never be read, and personal items abandoned mid-use. It was as if the passengers had simply vanished, leaving their lives suspended in the room like ghosts trapped in motion. The silence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the distant groan of the ship as it cut through the waves. I moved cautiously among the abandoned belongings, and a chilling realization settled in. The itinerary changes, the impossible schedules, the vanishing excursions, none of it was random. Patterns emerged from the chaos, sequences of times, cabin numbers, and locations that hinted at something deliberate, something dark. My heart hammered, every instinct screaming that the ship's shifts were orchestrated, calculated, a puzzle designed to trap its passengers in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Returning to my cabin for a brief respite, my breath caught as I saw the condensation on the mirror forming words in a fluid, almost deliberate hand. "You do not belong here." My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. Yet the message seemed to echo in my mind, resonating like a warning I couldn't ignore. Panic surged. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the deck. Certain escape was within reach, but the horizon told a different story. The familiar lights of any port were gone. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, dark and indifferent. The ship groaned under the weight of invisible forces. Waves slammed against the steel hull with a metallic clang that made the air taste of iron, while lights flickered above, throwing long, jagged shadows across the corridors. Every step I took was mirrored, distorted, as if the ship anticipated my movements, bending reality around me. My pulse raced. Vertigo clawed at my mind, and I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't merely lost. I was trapped on a vessel that moved on its own, following a route that had no end, a course designed to ensnare me indefinitely, and nothing in the world could prepare me for the nightmare I had willingly boarded. I sprinted down a corridor that seemed to stretch farther than physics allowed, my lungs burning and heart hammering like a drum. Shadows twisted unnaturally, along the walls curling and recoiling with each frantic step. Ahead, I saw crew members standing perfectly still, faces serene yet impossibly vacant. Their eyes tracked me with precision, too deliberate to be innocent. One stepped forward, voice low, measured. "It's best you stay where you belong." Every instinct screamed to flee, and I did, darting into another hallway. But the ship seemed alive, reshaping itself as I ran. Doors vanished, stairwells looped back on themselves, and familiar corridors twisted into alien shapes that made my head spin. I leaned against a wall, listening, trying to find the rhythm of this living vessel. The creak of steel beneath the waves, the distant echo of water against hull, and the whispers curling through the air were no longer subtle. They formed a pattern I couldn't decipher, a language the ship used to assert control. I realized that the crew were not acting independently. They were extensions of the ship, complicit in its labyrinthine reality, agents of a force that was patient, precise, and indifferent to human survival. I pressed forward, alternating between quiet observation and bursts of desperate speed, scanning for any sign of a lifeboat or exit. Every turn, every shadow, every reflected light held potential danger. I glimpsed figures in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach, always watching. The corridors looped impossibly, stairwells twisted into unending spirals, and I felt the walls closing in, constricting around me like the ship itself was aware of my presence, testing me. Finally, a faint green glow appeared at the end of a hallway. What could be a lifeboat hatch? I lunged toward it, adrenaline screaming through my veins, but the floor tilted beneath me, the corridor stretching into itself, throwing me back to the same starting point. Panic and despair collided, leaving me breathless. I understood then that I wasn't just lost. I was trapped in a sentient maze, a living nightmare that anticipated my every move, bending reality to ensure I could never truly escape. The ship's grip was absolute, and I was utterly powerless. I burst onto what I thought was an open deck, the night wind whipping against my face, the crash of waves against the hull ringing like a promise of freedom. My chest heaved, lungs burning, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe I had escaped the ship's suffocating grip. The horizon stretched endlessly, dark and quiet, offering the illusion of safety. Relief surged, fragile and fleeting, as I took a step forward. Then, the deck warped beneath me. The railing bent unnaturally. The lights flickered with a rhythm I had come to recognize, and the horizon folded into itself. The exit led me back to the same corridor where my ordeal had begun, the same oppressive silence greeting me. Panic clawed at my chest, raw and relentless. The ship was alive, sentient and indifferent, looping its victims through endless corridors and stairwells. Behind me, shadows shifted, hints of the crew or something far older and darker watching, waiting for the next misstep. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, the metallic tang of the sea thick in my mouth. Somewhere another passenger would soon hear the whispers, see the shadows and step aboard, and the cycle would repeat. I was trapped, swallowed by a vessel that had no end, no mercy, no exit. Reality and nightmare had fused, leaving only the cold, endless hum of the ocean, and the certainty that the cruise would claim its next victim just as it had me. I stepped onto the cruise ship, my excitement buzzing like electricity, ready for nights of music, performances, and the carefree laughter of fellow travelers. But almost immediately, something felt off. The entertainment crew moved with a precision that was almost inhuman, smiles too wide, gestures too exact, voices smooth and rehearsed as if repeating lines from some unseen script. I noticed passengers walking past, eyes vacant, expressions blank, smiles fixed, their movements eerily synchronized with the crew as if part of some ritual I couldn't understand. Corridors twisted slightly in ways I hadn't noticed on the map, angles misaligned, lights flickering in short bursts that made shadows dance in unnatural ways. The hum of the ship's engines carried a strange resonance, low and persistent, like it was aware of every step I took. Footsteps echoed where no one walked, and the faint whisper of laughter, too soft to locate, snaked around corners, teasing me. By nightfall, the anomalies became impossible to ignore. Reflections and polished railings seemed to lag behind my movements, shadows stretched against walls where no light should have fallen. I clutched my itinerary, realizing the shows and events listed made no sense. Times shifted inexplicably, and the crew's robotic precision suggested they weren't entirely human. A creeping sense of isolation wrapped around me, thick and cold, and I understood that this cruise wasn't just a vacation, it was the first act in a nightmare that had only just begun. I hurried to the main theater, hoping to catch a rehearsal or at least confirm the evening's entertainment schedule. But the lobby was quiet in a way that made my stomach tighten. Crew members moved past me with stiff, rehearsed steps, nodding curtly without meeting my eyes. I asked a young woman in a bright uniform about the schedule, and she smiled. Too wide, too perfect. "Everything is on track," she said, her voice monotone, as if reading from a script. When I pressed for details about the shows, her gaze flicked to some point behind me and she repeated, "Everything is on track, word for word, confused comma." I glanced around the theater and noticed the seats were occupied by passengers who didn't seem to notice me. They sat in rigid rows, heads slightly tilted, expressions blank, hands resting in identical positions on their laps. One man slowly raised a hand, paused, and then dropped it exactly the same way as the person beside him. The synchronization was subtle but unmistakable, like the ship itself had rehearsed them. I turned down another corridor to double-check the itinerary posted on a digital display. Times for shows and events shifted before my eyes. A jazz performance vanished entirely, replaced by a non-existent magic act scheduled at 2 a.m. I felt the walls closing in, the air thickening with tension, and the shadows along. The hall seemed to stretch and move independently of the flickering lights. Mirrors reflected shapes I didn't recognize, figures lingering behind my own reflection, vanishing the moment I spun around. My anxiety surged as I realized the ship wasn't static. Corridors subtly shifted when I walked, familiar corners, twisting into impossible angles, doorways appearing where none had existed before. Footsteps echoed in hallways that were empty, whispers skimming along the walls with no source. Every attempt to interact with crew or passengers ended the same. Rehearsed responses, blank stares, robotic gestures, and a feeling that I was the only person awake in a vessel built to perform around me. The combination of subtle distortions, mechanical movements, and unnatural silence left me hollow with dread. This was no ordinary cruise, and I could feel the ship watching, waiting, testing my every move. The ship's corridors had begun to feel alien, unfamiliar, despite my careful study of the map. Drawn by a flicker of light at the far end of a hallway, I ventured down a narrow, seldom-used passage that didn't appear on my itinerary. The air was thick, heavy with the mingled scent of salt, and something metallic, and each step echoed, unnaturally, bouncing off walls that seemed to lean in closer as I moved. Shadows warped, stretching along corners where no light reached, and for a moment I questioned if the hallway itself was bending around me. I passed a cluster of passengers huddled near a stairwell. They murmured softly to one another. Voices, low, rhythmic. The perfect performance, the rhythm of the ship. Their words repeated like a chant, calm and hypnotic, yet every glance they cast toward me felt loaded with an impossible awareness, as though they knew I didn't belong. I tried to speak, to ask a question, but my voice came out thin, swallowed by the oppressive air. They didn't respond, only continued their murmuring, faces blank, movements unnervingly synchronized. The hallways twisted in ways that made me dizzy, stairwells looping back impossibly, creating the sensation that no matter which direction I ran, I was trapped inside a shifting maze. I stumbled, gripping the railing, my heart hammering, and caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Just beyond the corner, a dark figure watching. It didn't advance or retreat, but I felt its gaze, heavy and deliberate, pressing against the back of my mind. I spun around. The figure was gone, leaving only the warped light and distorted walls. Vertigo clawed at me, the boundaries between reality and hallucination dissolving. Every corridor led back to another. Every turn stretched longer than it should have, and the ship seemed to pulse around me, alive and attentive. Footsteps echoed in tandem with my own. Whispers followed the edges of my hearing, and the hypnotized passengers floated past, oblivious to the chaos. Panic surged. I realized that the vessel was no longer a simple cruise ship, but a living labyrinth designed to ensnare, confuse, and terrify. Escape felt impossible, and every heartbeat reminded me that I was alone in a nightmare that bent reality itself. I found a narrow door tucked behind a curtain of heavy velvet, almost hidden in a shadowed hallway. Pushing it open, I stepped into a backstage area that time had abandoned. Costumes hung half on racks, sequins catching the dim light, their once vibrant colors dulled with dust. Props were scattered across the floor, fake swords, top hats, masks frozen in expressions of eternal performance. Open notebooks and half-written letters lay atop tables, each page a fragment of someone's story, someone who had evidently never left this ship. The air was thick with the combined scent of sweat, mildew, and something metallic that made my stomach churn. Dot patterns began to emerge from the chaos. Notes detailed rehearsal schedules, sequences of events, and times that matched the impossibly shifting itineraries I had seen earlier. The crew's rigid movements, the hypnotized passengers, the strange synchronization, they weren't random. Each act, each smile, each step followed a deliberate design, a cruel choreography I had stumbled into without consent. The realization sent a shiver crawling up my spine. Rushing back to my cabin, I sought solace in reflection, only to find a message scrawled across the condensation of my mirror. "You don't belong on stage." My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, the words sinking into my chest like an anchor. Panic surged and I bolted for the nearest deck, convinced that if I could just escape the interior, the open air might save me. But the horizon betrayed me. The familiar lights of any port were absent. Waves crashed against the hull with a metallic clang that echoed unnervingly through the corridors, and the lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally across walls. The ship moved with deliberate intent, circling endlessly, at sea indifferent to my desperate attempts at escape. Each step was met with vertigo, each breath tasted of iron and salt, and every corner seemed to warp just as I approached it. The more I tried to find a way out, the more the environment resisted, folding in on itself like a living puzzle. I realized then that the ship wasn't just haunted or strange. It was orchestrated, sentient in its own way, and utterly hostile. I was trapped inside a nightmare that played out like a performance, and I had no role other than to survive its terrifying rhythm. I rounded a corner and froze. The crew was waiting, every member perfectly still, faces eerily serene, eyes glinting. In the dim light like polished glass, their movements were too precise, too synchronized, and the moment one stepped forward, my skin prickled with the realization these weren't human. Something unnatural lingered beneath the surface, mechanical, supernatural, or something I had no words for. Panic surged, and I turned, sprinting down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against walls that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Doors vanished as I approached them, stairwells twisted into impossible spirals, and hallways folded back, on themselves, looping endlessly. Every turn led me deeper into the ship's labyrinth, each shadow flickering with unseen observers. I caught glimpses of them, crew members gliding silently behind doors, just at the edge of my vision, or standing, in doorways that appeared and disappeared as if the ship itself was testing me. My breath came in ragged bursts as I darted from corridor to corridor, alternating between frantic flight and tense observation. I pressed my back to walls, listening to the metallic thrum of waves against the hull, the faint hiss of ventilation, the whispers that seemed to seep from the wood and steel itself. Every sound, every flicker of light, every warped shadow reminded me I was not just trapped on a ship. I was trapped in a sentient machine, a living performance that expected obedience and punished defiance. I glimpsed a faint green glow at the end of a hallway, what could be a lifeboat hatch. Hope surged, and I sprinted toward it, only for the floor to tilt beneath me, the corridor elongating and twisting so that I was thrown back to the same central chamber I had passed moments ago. My chest heaved, sweat stinging my eyes, and I realized that the chase was endless. The ship anticipated my moves, bending space and perception, turning corridors into traps, doors into illusions. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum, and my mind raced with terror and disbelief. The crew's inhuman presence was a constant, silent reminder of the horror surrounding me. I was alone against something alive, something patient, precise, and utterly merciless. The labyrinthine ship didn't just confine my body. It toyed with my mind, tightening a psychological vice around me with every desperate step I took toward escape. I stumbled onto what I thought was an open deck, the night air cold against my skin, the sound of waves pounding against the hull like a warning. My chest heaved, heart hammering as relief and hope surged through me. For a fleeting moment I allowed myself to believe I had finally escaped the ship's suffocating grip, that I might glimpse the horizon, see the faint glow of a port, and reclaim my freedom. But the deck warped beneath my feet. The railing bent. At impossible angles, lights flickered with the rhythm I had learned to dread, and the horizon folded into itself, revealing the same corridors, the same walls I had tried desperately to outrun. The exit led me back to where my nightmare had begun, a relentless loop confirming that the ship was alive, sentient, and utterly indifferent to human struggle. Shadows shifted behind me, and I realized the crew, or whatever they were, watched silently, patient, waiting for the next mistake. Somewhere another passenger would soon board, drawn into the same trap, hypnotized by the rhythm of the ship. I was trapped, swallowed by a vessel that had no mercy, no end, no escape. Reality and nightmare had fused, leaving only the cold, endless hum of the ocean, and the certainty that this cruise would claim its next victim just as it had claimed me. I've been on cruises before, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. People talk about the ocean like it's peaceful, calming, even romantic. But the truth is, when you're out there in the middle of nowhere, it feels more like standing at the edge of an abyss. There's no sound except the low hum of the engines, no land in sight, just black water stretching endlessly in every direction. And when you lean over the railing, staring down at the waves breaking below, it hits you. If something were to reach up from underneath, no one would ever hear you scream. I remember the exact moment it happened. I had slipped into the water after midnight, ignoring the rules, thinking it would be thrilling to say I swam in the open ocean off a cruise ship. At first it felt like freedom, weightless, suspended under 1,000 stars. But then, something brushed against my leg. It wasn't seaweed, it wasn't the current, it was deliberate. A touch that lingered. When I climbed back onto the deck, dripping and breathless, I thought I had escaped. But the truth is, whatever I disturbed out there, it didn't stay behind. Cruise ships are strange places. They're crowded with thousands of people, every hallway humming with laughter, clinking glasses, and the muffled thump of music leaking from bars. Yet somehow, I often felt more alone there than anywhere else. Maybe it's because no matter how many smiling faces pass you by, you can't escape the truth. You're trapped on a floating city, cut off from the rest of the world by endless miles of water. Everyone else seemed to love that illusion of freedom. But for me, it only made the walls feel tighter. That night, after most of the passengers had gone to bed, I wandered to the back deck where the lights were dimmer and the staff rarely patrolled. The air smelled like salt and fuel, the ship's engines vibrating faintly under my feet. I leaned against the railing, staring down at the black surface below. The water seemed bottomless, shifting and writhing as though it had its own pulse. I don't know what pushed me to do it, maybe boredom, maybe pride, but I climbed over the barrier, took a breath, and slipped into the ocean. The cold shocked me instantly, wrapping around my chest like a fist. My ears filled with silence broken only by the distant churn of propellers. Above me, the ship loomed impossibly tall, lit windows glowing like scattered stars. I floated there, arms outstretched, weightless beneath an infinite sky. For a fleeting second, it felt exhilarating, like I had escaped the ship's suffocating luxury and finally touched something real. Then I felt it. A brush against my leg. At first I told myself it was nothing, just the wake or a drifting piece of kelp. But then it slid across again, slower this time, curling along my skin like fingers. My chest tightened. I kicked hard, scanning the water, but there was nothing. Only the endless black dot. My heart hammered as I reached for the rope ladder dangling from the deck, pulling myself up with frantic urgency. Every muscle screamed as though something were tugging at me from below, resisting my escape. When I finally scrambled onto the slick metal platform, gasping, I looked back at the water. It rippled once, unnaturally, as if something vast had retreated into the deep. I should have walked away right then. Instead, I stood dripping on the deck, shivering, unable to shake the feeling that the ocean was still watching me. By the time I stumbled back to my cabin, the adrenaline had faded, leaving only a strange heaviness pressing against my chest. My skin burned with salt, and no matter how many towels I used, the dampness clung to me. I changed clothes, tossed the wet ones onto the floor, but when I woke up an hour later, the new shirt felt clammy, as though the ocean air had seeped into the fabric itself. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the unease followed me everywhere. Walking down the hall toward breakfast the next morning, I noticed something odd, wet footprints leading along the carpet. At first I thought someone had just come from the pool, but these prints didn't head toward the elevators or the sun deck. They ended abruptly in the middle of the corridor, as if whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air. That night, I tried to distract myself with the ship's entertainment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I swore I caught movement, shadows slipping around corners, reflections that didn't quite match my own. When I returned to my room, the door stood cracked open. I froze. I remembered locking it. Inside, everything looked untouched. My suitcase was still shut, my belongings neatly stacked. But the air was damp, heavy, as if the room had been flooded with invisible seawater. The curtains stirred, though the balcony door was closed. I shut the door, bolted it, and pressed my back against the wall, listening. For a long time there was only silence. Then, a soft creak. The bathroom door edged open on its own dot. My pulse roared in my ears. I forced myself to check to prove it was nothing. The lights flickered as I stepped inside, and in the mirror above the sink I saw droplets sliding down my reflection's cheek. I touched my face, dry, but in the glass water dripped steadily from my hair, rolling down my chin like I had just climbed out of the sea. I stumbled backward, clutching the counter, but when I blinked, the image was gone. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly dry. Still, the damp chill lingered in the air, wrapping around me like unseen arms. That night I barely slept. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean hadn't stayed outside. Somehow, it had followed me in . It wasn't just me anymore. By the third day, whispers of strange things spread among the passengers. A woman claimed she woke in the night to the sound of water running beneath her bed. A man said his balcony furniture was soaked when he stepped outside in the morning, though the sea had been calm all night. People laughed it off as quirks of the ship, but their eyes betrayed the same unease that gnawed at me. Then someone went missing. A young guy, maybe early 20s, had been seen swimming in the pool after hours. The next morning, his towel and sandals were still there, but he wasn't. Security searched the decks, questioned the crew, but no one admitted to seeing him leave. They said maybe he'd fallen overboard. The casual way they said it chilled. Me, like being swallowed by the ocean, was just another possibility you accepted when you stepped on board. That night, my dreams turned violent. I drowned over and over, lungs filling with salt water as voices whispered in the dark. Sometimes they were calling me closer, promising release. Other times they accused me, telling me I had brought this aboard. I woke choking, the sheets damp as though I'd been dragged into the depths and thrown back. During the day, the ship no longer felt like a luxury escape. It felt like a trap. The corridors reeked faintly of brine, and sometimes when I walked alone I heard it, the sound of water sloshing steadily behind me, though the carpet was dry. Once I turned sharply and swore I saw a slick trail vanishing around the corner. The guilt grew heavier with each step. I kept replaying that night in the ocean, the way something had brushed against me, the way I had escaped and climbed back, leaving it behind. Or so I thought. What if I hadn't? What if the missing boy had gone looking for the same thrill and found what I'd disturbed? Every creak of the hull sounded like the ocean breathing inside the walls. Every shadow swayed like something submerged. I stopped speaking to other passengers. I didn't want them to know. I didn't want them to suspect that whatever haunted this ship had come looking for me first. By the fourth night, I couldn't pretend anymore. The ship itself felt wrong, groaning against invisible currents, shuddering as though something vast swam just beneath it. I locked myself in my cabin, determined to ride out whatever this was. But at midnight the lights flickered, and shadows began to ripple across the walls. Not ordinary shadows. These moved like currents, bending and twisting as if I were trapped at the bottom of the sea. My belongings lifted slowly from the floor. Shoes, a book, even the lamp beside the bed, suspended weightlessly as though gravity had dissolved. I reached out, but the air felt thick and wet, dragging against my fingers. My lungs tightened, every breath tasting of salt. The walls groaned. The ship lurched violently, sending me crashing into the desk. And then I saw it. A shape coalescing in the corner, darker than the room, stretching long and skeletal. Its limbs bent wrong, gliding without sound, dripping water that never touched the carpet. Its face, or what passed for one, was blurred, features shifting like waves. I knew with a certainty that hollowed me out that this was what had brushed against me in the water. It had never let go. I bolted, throwing open the door, sprinting into the narrow corridor. The lights above swayed, spraying sparks as water trickled from unseen cracks. Behind me, the sloshing grew louder, closer, like the hall itself was flooding. Doors rattled, violently as if something inside each room wanted out. I ran blind, twisting through passageways, heart hammering, until I reached my own cabin again. only I don't remember turning back. The door slammed behind me. The floor pitched upward. I stumbled and suddenly I was choking, water surging around my ankles, rising impossibly fast. I clawed at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Salt water filled the room, lifting me toward the ceiling. Furniture spun beside me, weightless, colliding with my body. The shadows writhed below, reaching upward, pulling me down into their grasp. Gasped, but the breath never came. Only the ocean did, pouring into me, filling every part until there was no telling where I ended and it began. I don't remember how I survived that night. One moment I was drowning in my cabin, shadows dragging me under, and the next I was coughing seawater onto the floor, the room dry, silent, as if nothing had happened. No alarms, no flooding, no evidence except the taste of salt burning in my throat. I told myself it was a dream, but deep down I knew the truth. Some things you can't wake up from. The rest of the cruise blurred past me. Passengers laughed, drank, and danced. But I moved like a ghost among them, waiting for the next ripple in the walls, the next creak of something that wasn't the ship. At dawn on the final day, I stood at the railing, staring down into the endless black below. I almost climbed over. Part of me believed if I gave myself back to the ocean, it might let the rest of them go. But I couldn't do it. I was too afraid. Too selfish. When we docked, people cheered. Families reunited. I stepped onto dry land, sunlight warm on my face. For a moment I thought it was over. Then I heard it, drip, drip, right behind me. I remember the exact moment I realized the bracelet wasn't just stuck. It was alive. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the polished surface glinted under the deck lamps. But no. The band around my wrist pulsed, faintly, like it had its own heartbeat. My skin tightened beneath it, and when I tried to tug it off, it refused to budge, clinging like flesh to bone. That's when the panic set in. They'd given it to me when I boarded, a sleek wristband meant to unlock my cabin, pay for drinks, track my activities. Everyone wore one. They made it sound like convenience, luxury, the perfect symbol of a carefree vacation. But no one told me it would feel like a shackle. No one warned me it would grow warmer the closer I stood to the railing, as though it recognized the endless black sea waiting below. The ship was supposed to be paradise, a floating city where worries couldn't touch you. Yet the deeper into that ocean we sailed, the more I felt the opposite. I wasn't free. I was marked. Bound to something I didn't understand, and worse, something that wasn't done with me. When I first boarded the ship, everything was presented with polished smiles and rehearsed charm. A glass of champagne was pressed into my hand, a camera flash captured my arrival, and before I even reached my cabin, a crew member clasped the wristband onto me. Sleek, silver, minimalistic. It looked like an expensive fitness tracker. They explained how it worked. Tap it against any scanner to pay, swipe it to open my room, use it to check in for activities. Seamless, they called it. You'll never need to carry a wallet. Everyone around me seemed impressed. I admit I was too. At first, it felt like part of the vacation magic. Another little indulgence that screamed convenience. But later, when I tried to slip it off, I realized I couldn't. It didn't budge. I twisted it, pulled, even pressed. The edges where I thought a clasp should be. Nothing. It sat flush against my skin, tighter than before. I laughed awkwardly, assuming it was just secure. But when I asked a staff member how to remove it, his smile faltered. "Why would you want to take it off?" he said, before quickly redirecting me toward the buffet. That should have been my first warning. By the second day, I began noticing things. The bracelet felt heavier, almost dragging my arm down, and when I lay in bed at night, I swore I could feel it throb faintly, as if it had a pulse. Sometimes I pressed 2 fingers against it, half convinced I'd feel a heartbeat. And I did. Not mine. Something slower, deeper, like the echo of a drum underwater. I tried not to let it get to me. After all, everyone else wore theirs without complaint, laughing as they tapped into bars and shops. But I couldn't ignore the way my skin tingled beneath it, raw and tender like the band was slowly sinking in. I kept telling myself it was harmless, just a clever piece of tech. Still, every time I glanced down, I felt an irrational dread. The bracelet wasn't just tracking me, it was claiming me. And no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't let go. By the third night, whispers had started making their way through the ship. A woman at dinner mentioned her husband never came back from a late walk on the upper deck. Another couple swore they'd seen security quietly escorting someone's luggage off the ship in the middle of the night. No announcements were made, no explanations offered. But you could feel it in the air. People were going missing. And every story seemed to circle back to the bracelets. When I asked a bartender if it was possible to get a replacement, his smile froze on his face. He shook his head quickly and poured my drink without another word. A housekeeper I cornered in the hall refused to even look at my wrist, muttering something under her breath as she pushed past me. It was as if the staff had been trained not to acknowledge what we all wore, not to admit what we were bound to. That night, I snapped. I locked myself in my cabin, grabbed the scissors from my toiletry kit, and dug the blade under the edge of the band. I expected resistance, but what I felt instead was impossible. The blade bent, not snapped, not dulled, bent like it had hit solid steel. I tried again, harder this time, and the bracelet grew warm, humming faintly against my skin until I dropped the scissors in shock. I hardly slept. When I did drift off, I dreamed of drowning. Cold water poured over my head, dragging me down as pale hands clawed at my body. Voices rose in the darkness, whispering my name, promising that resistance was pointless. I woke thrashing, gasping for air, my sheets twisted around me. And that's when I saw it. My arm was wet. Not just damp with sweat, wet as if it had been plunged into the sea. Salt stung my nostrils, and tiny rivulets dripped from the bracelet onto the carpet. I scrambled for a towel, but even after drying, my skin burned and tingled. The bracelet pulsed once hard as though it had a heartbeat of its own, and I realized, horrified, that I hadn't just dreamed of drowning. Something had been trying to finish what it started. By the end of the week, the cruise no longer felt like a vacation. It felt like a trap drifting in the middle of nowhere, each day bleeding into the next as more passengers quietly vanished. Their names weren't announced, their absences never acknowledged, but you could see it in the empty tables at dinner, the luggage left unclaimed outside the cabins. Rumors spread like wildfire. People said the disappearances always happened at night, and always to those who still wore the bracelets, which meant all of us. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, paranoia. But then I noticed mine glowing, faintly in the dark. Just a soft shimmer at first, a pale bluish light like something bioluminescent deep beneath the waves. Whenever the ship creaked or the waters grew rough, the glow intensified, and the band seemed to cinch tighter around my wrist, squeezing until my pulse stuttered. That's when the whispers began. Faint at first, like the hush of waves against the hull. But the longer I listened, the more they formed words. A voice, not male or female, not entirely human, slid into my thoughts. It promised me safety if I obeyed. It whispered of peace in the water, release from fear. Yet in the same breath, it told me death was inevitable. It felt less like a threat and more like a fact being delivered. I stopped eating with the other passengers. I stopped talking to the crew. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, though half the time I couldn't tell if they belonged to people or to the sea itself. The bracelet pulsed when someone disappeared, as if celebrating. Sometimes, lying awake at night, I wondered if it was choosing, if the thing inside it decided who stayed, who sank. And the guilt ate at me. Because what if it wasn't random? What if I had been marked first, that night when the band refused to come off? What if every person dragged away since then had only vanished because I kept resisting? I wanted to believe I was imagining it. But every time the whispers slid through my head, I could feel the truth. This wasn't a bracelet. It was a bond. And I wasn't wearing it. It was wearing me. I shouldn't have gone exploring, but paranoia drove me. One night, when most passengers were asleep and the halls were silent except for the steady thrum of the engines, I followed a crew member who slipped through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." I waited until he was gone, then forced it open. What I found made my blood freeze. The room was filled with boxes stacked to the ceiling, each one overflowing with bracelets. Hundreds, maybe thousands, piled like discarded bones. But they weren't lifeless. Even in the darkness, I could see them glowing faintly, pulsing in unison like a colony of deep-sea creatures breathing together. The sound in the room wasn't silence. It was a low hum, a heartbeat that rattled my teeth. And in that instant, I understood these weren't souvenirs, they were bindings. The bracelets weren't for convenience. They were offerings, a pact. The cruise didn't run on luxury. It ran on sacrifice. I stumbled back to my cabin, shaking, desperate to pretend I hadn't seen. But the moment I shut the door, the shadows began to ripple. They stretched across the walls like black water, writhing, reaching. My bracelet seared against my skin, burning hot, and before I could scream, water erupted across the floor. It didn't seep from the bathroom or the balcony or the ceiling. It surged upward from nothing, swallowing the carpet, rising faster than I could move. My bed floated. My suitcase tipped over. The air turned briny, impossible to breathe. I clawed at the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle slick, twisting uselessly in my hands. The shadows thickened, coalescing into shapes that moved against the current. Faceless, immense. Something vast pressed against the thin walls of my cabin, its presence crushing, suffocating. My bracelet tightened until I thought my bone would snap. It wasn't resisting anymore, it was claiming me. I ran, bursting into the corridor, sloshing through ankle-deep water that should never have been there. The lights flickered violently, alarms silent, as though the ship refused to acknowledge what was happening. Behind me, I heard it, the roar of the ocean, alive and furious, surging after me down the narrow halls. And still, the whispers carried through the rushing tide. "You're mine now." I knew there was only one way to end it. The ship was sinking in silence, corridors drowning in water only I seemed to see, and the bracelet's fire seared through my veins. I stumbled to the open deck, wind lashing my face, the ocean churning black below. For one desperate heartbeat, I thought of the others, of all the people swallowed before me, of those who might follow if I didn't act. I climbed the railing, my hands shaking, the bracelet glowing brighter than ever, tightening like a vice. And then I jumped. The ocean swallowed me whole. For a moment it felt like surrender, like falling into the arms of something ancient. The bracelet pulsed one last time, then slipped free, drifting weightless into the abyss. My lungs filled, and everything went black. But that isn't the only ending. Because sometimes I dream I survived. The cruise docked, families cheered. I stepped back onto solid ground, sunlight warming my skin, the nightmare fading behind me. For the first time in days, I felt free. Until I woke the next morning. My wrist throbbed. The bracelet was still there, tighter than ever, dripping seawater onto the floor.